Imagine, if you will, the world in the late 1940s. World War II has ended, but the dust has barely settled. The United States and the Soviet Union, once uneasy allies, now stare at each other across an ideological chasm that threatens to consume the world. Nuclear weapons exist, terrifying in their destructive power, and both superpowers are racing to develop the means to deliver these weapons across continents. The atomic age has arrived, and with it comes a desperate need for aircraft capable of carrying these massive bombs deep into enemy territory. The United States Army Air Forces, soon to become the independent United States Air Force, faced a critical problem. Their existing bomber fleet, dominated by the B-29 Stratofortress and the newer B-36 Peacemaker, had limitations that could prove fatal in a nuclear confrontation. The B-36, while possessing impressive range, was slow, cumbersome and vulnerable to the new generation of jet fighters emerging from Soviet design bureaus. The jet-powered B-47 Stratojet was faster and more modern, but it lacked the range and payload capacity needed for true intercontinental missions without extensive aerial refueling support. Into this gap stepped Boeing with a proposal that would change everything. But what if that proposal had been rejected? What if the Air Force had chosen a different path? What if budget constraints, political opposition, or simple bad luck had killed the B-52 program before it ever flew? To understand what we would have lost, we need to understand what made the B-52 so revolutionary and so enduring. The Stratofortress wasn't just another bomber. It represented a perfect convergence of emerging technologies. 8 turbojet engines, providing unprecedented power and speed, swept wings offering efficiency at high altitudes, sophisticated bombing and navigation systems, and a massive payload capacity that could accommodate both conventional and nuclear weapons. The aircraft that first flew in 1952 would go on to serve for more than 70 years, an almost inconceivable lifespan for a military aircraft, and current plans suggest it could remain in service until 2050 or beyond, giving it a potential century of operational life. Without the B-52, the entire structure of American nuclear deterrence would have evolved along radically different lines. The concept of the nuclear triad, the three-pronged approach to nuclear weapons delivery, consisting of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers, would have been fundamentally compromised. The bomber leg of this triad has always been unique because, unlike missiles that once launched cannot be recalled, bombers can be sent aloft during a crisis, demonstrating resolve and readiness, but then recalled if tensions ease. This flexibility has been credited with preventing escalation during numerous Cold War crises, providing presidents with options between doing nothing and launching irreversible nuclear strikes. Without the B-52, this crucial middle ground would have been far less credible. The United States would have been forced to rely more heavily on the B-36 and B-47, both of which had significant vulnerabilities. The B-36, with its mix of piston and jet engines, was a maintenance nightmare and increasingly obsolete as Soviet air defenses improved throughout the 1950s. The B-47, while more modern, required extensive tanker support and had a much smaller payload capacity. If the B-52 had never existed, the Air Force might have pushed harder for the B-58 Hustler, a supersonic bomber that did enter service but proved to be expensive, complex, and limited in its mission flexibility. Or perhaps they would have accelerated development of what became the B-70 Valkyrie, a Mach 3 strategic bomber that was ultimately cancelled due to cost and the advent of surface-to-air missiles. Either path would have cost far more money and provided far less operational capability than the remarkably adaptable B-52. Consider the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, perhaps the closest humanity has come to nuclear war. During those 13 days in October, B-52s were kept on continuous airborne alert, orbiting at predetermined points where they could strike Soviet targets within hours if ordered. This visible demonstration of American readiness and capability played a crucial role in the crisis's resolution. Without the B-52's range, endurance, and payload capacity, maintaining such an airborne alert would have been far more difficult, perhaps impossible with the aircraft available. The psychological impact of dozens of nuclear-armed bombers constantly in the air, ready to strike, sent an unmistakable message to Soviet leadership. Alternative bombers simply couldn't have sustained this operation with the same effectiveness. The absence of the B-52 would have fundamentally altered the Vietnam War as well. While the strategic bombing campaigns of Vietnam remained controversial, there's no denying that the B-52's ability to deliver massive conventional payloads had a profound impact on the conflict. Operations like Arc Light, where B-52s flew from bases in Guam and Thailand to strike targets in Vietnam, demonstrated a new kind of aerial warfare. The psychological effect of B-52 strikes, known among those who experienced them as producing an unforgettable terror, influenced battlefield outcomes in ways that smaller tactical bombers could not replicate. Without the Stratofortress, the United States would have needed many more fighter bombers and tactical aircraft to deliver equivalent tonnage, stretching logistics, maintenance, and pilot resources far thinner. The nature of air support for ground forces would have been fundamentally different, possibly altering the course of battles and campaigns throughout the war. The technology development pipeline would have evolved along different trajectories as well. The B-52 program drove innovations in jet engine design, avionics, bombing systems, and electronic warfare that rippled through the entire aerospace industry. Boeing's experience with the Stratofortress directly influenced the development of commercial jetliners, including the famous 707, which revolutionized air travel. The swept-wing design, the lessons learned in manufacturing large jet aircraft, and the supply chain developed for the B-52 program all contributed to America's dominance in commercial aviation. Without this catalyst, the jet age of passenger travel might have developed more slowly or been led by European manufacturers who were also working on jet airliners but often trailed Boeing in certain key technologies. Let's think about the Cold War's later decades. As intercontinental ballistic missiles became more reliable and submarine-launched missiles more capable, some argued that strategic bombers were becoming obsolete. Yet the B-52 proved invaluable precisely because of its flexibility. It could be rapidly retargeted, could carry different weapon types, and could perform missions that missiles simply couldn't. The development of air-launched cruise missiles transformed the B-52 into a standoff platform that could launch weapons from outside the range of enemy air defenses, extending its viability for decades. Without the B-52 as a proven platform for these new weapons, the cruise missile program itself might have developed differently, perhaps relying more on ground-based or sea-based systems, which would have altered both the military balance and arms control negotiations throughout the 1970s and 80s. The Reagan-era defense buildup of the 1980s included plans for a new strategic bomber, which became the B-1B Lancer. However, the continued capability of the modernized B-52 force meant that the bomber force could maintain effectiveness even as B-1 production was capped at 100 aircraft rather than the original plan for over 200. Without the B-52, the United States might have been forced to build far more B-1s at tremendous cost, or the bomber force might have atrophied to dangerous levels. The subsequent development of the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber benefited from the knowledge that it would supplement rather than replace the B-52, allowing for a smaller, more specialized buy of just 21 aircraft. In a world without the Stratofortress, The entire bomber modernization program from the 1980s through the 2000s would have followed a different, likely more expensive and less effective path. Fast forward to the post-Cold War era, and the B-52's absence becomes even more significant. The Gulf War of 1991 showcased the B-52's ability to operate in a high-intensity conventional conflict, launching cruise missiles and dropping precision-guided munitions. The conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq that followed saw the B-52 reinvented yet again as a close air support platform, loitering over battlefields for hours and delivering precision strikes in support of ground forces. This mission, barely imaginable when the aircraft was designed in the late 1940s, demonstrates an adaptability that alternative aircraft likely wouldn't have possessed. A supersonic bomber like the B-58 or B-70, had it remained in service, would have been poorly suited to these low-intensity, long-duration missions. Fighter bombers could provide close air support, but not with the payload capacity and endurance of the B-52. The global military balance would have shifted in subtle but important ways as well. The B-52's existence influenced Soviet and later Russian military planning for decades. They developed extensive air defense networks specifically designed to counter the threat of American strategic bombers. These systems, in turn, influenced NATO tactics and technology development. Without the B-52, Soviet military investment might have focused more heavily on anti-shipping capabilities to counter American carrier battle groups, or on theater-range systems to threaten Western Europe, potentially altering the conventional military balance in ways that could have affected crisis stability and even the timing of the Cold War's end. Think about the human dimension of this alternative history. Tens of thousands of air crews have flown the B-52 over 7 decades. The training pipelines, the organizational structures, the doctrines and tactics developed around this aircraft have shaped the culture of the Air Force's bomber community. In today's B-52 squadrons, it's possible for a pilot to fly the same tail-number aircraft that his grandfather flew decades earlier, creating a unique continuity of service and tradition. This institutional knowledge, passed down through generations, has been invaluable in maintaining bomber capabilities even as technology and missions evolved. Without the B-52, this continuity would have been broken multiple times as aircraft were retired and replaced, potentially losing critical expertise and corporate knowledge with each transition. The industrial base consequences are worth considering as well. The B-52 program sustained Boeing's bomber production capabilities for years and maintained a network of suppliers and subcontractors who specialized in military aviation. This industrial capacity proved crucial when later programs like the B-1 and B-2 were developed. Without the continuous work provided by B-52 production and modification programs, some of these companies might have exited the defense market, leaving the United States with a weaker industrial base when it needed to develop new systems. The long-term maintenance and upgrade programs for the B-52 have also driven innovations in extending aircraft service life and modernizing old airframes, knowledge that has applications far beyond this one aircraft type. Now consider the diplomatic implications. The B-52 became such an iconic symbol of American military power that its presence or absence in a region sent clear political messages. When B-52s deployed to Guam or to bases in Europe or the Middle East, allies were reassured and potential adversaries took notice. The aircraft became a tool of deterrence, not just through its capabilities, but through its symbolic weight. Without the B-52, American reassurance to allies and deterrent signaling to adversaries would have required different mechanisms, perhaps more reliance on forward-deployed ground forces or naval assets, which carry different political implications and costs. The very vocabulary of military diplomacy would have been different. Let's examine the technological trajectory more deeply. The B-52's 8-engine configuration while seemingly inefficient compared to more modern 2- or 4-engine designs, has proven remarkably adaptable. The aircraft has gone through multiple engine upgrades, and current plans call for re-engineering the entire fleet yet again with modern, efficient turbofans that will dramatically improve performance and reduce operating costs. This modularity, this ability to swap out major components and systems while maintaining the basic airframe, has been key to the B-52's longevity. If the Air Force had instead invested in more integrated, optimized designs like the B-58 or B-70, these aircraft would likely have been far more difficult to upgrade and might have forced earlier retirement as they became obsolete, creating capability gaps and requiring expensive replacement programs. The nuclear weapons complex itself would have evolved differently without the B-52. The aircraft was designed to carry a wide variety of nuclear weapons, from early atomic bombs to modern cruise missiles. The requirements of the B-52 influenced weapon design, including size, weight, safety systems, and arming mechanisms. Without this platform, nuclear weapon designers might have focused more exclusively on warheads for ballistic missiles, potentially limiting the diversity of the nuclear arsenal and reducing flexibility in nuclear planning. The ability to rapidly change the targets and timing of bomber-delivered weapons, impossible with silo-based missiles, has been considered an important hedge against unexpected scenarios. This flexibility would have been greatly reduced without a capable long-range bomber. Consider also the international arms control regime. Treaties like START, which limited strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, treated bombers differently than missiles, in part because of their different characteristics, particularly their recoilability. The B-52 was central to these calculations. In a world where the bomber leg of the triad was weaker or non-existent, arms control negotiations might have taken very different forms, perhaps focusing more exclusively on missile systems. This could have altered the strategic balance in ways that might have made agreements harder to reach or less stable once concluded. The complexity of the nuclear balance, with its multiple dimensions and delivery systems, has arguably contributed to strategic stability by making first-strike scenarios more difficult to execute successfully. The economic impact of the B-52 program over 70-plus years has been substantial. The initial production run employed thousands of workers directly and many more in the supply chain. Ongoing maintenance, modifications, and upgrade programs have provided steady work for decades, supporting communities around Air Force bases and contractor facilities. The expertise developed in keeping these aging aircraft flying has created a specialized workforce with knowledge of systems engineering, obsolescence management, and incremental modernization that has value far beyond this one program. Without the B-52, this economic activity would have been distributed differently, perhaps more episodically, with boom and bust cycles matching new aircraft production programs, potentially making the defense industrial base less stable. Look at how the B-52's presence shaped adversary strategies and capabilities. Soviet and Russian air defense systems, fighter aircraft, and electronic warfare capabilities were developed with the B-52 threat clearly in mind. This drove a technological competition that had spillover effects throughout military aviation. Without the B-52, the Soviet Union might have invested those same resources differently, perhaps accelerating naval aviation or theater nuclear forces, potentially creating different vulnerabilities or advantages in the overall military balance. The action-reaction cycle of military technology development would have spun in different directions, leading to a different constellation of capabilities on both sides by the end of the Cold War. There's also a cultural and historical legacy that would be missing from a world without the B-52. The aircraft has appeared in countless films, books, and documentaries. It's been the subject of songs and has become embedded in popular culture as a symbol of both American military might and the nuclear age itself. Riding a B-52 or calling in a B-52 strike became phrases with meaning beyond their literal military significance. This cultural presence has shaped how multiple generations of Americans and people around the world think about military power, deterrence, and the Cold War. Without this iconic aircraft, the cultural landscape would have different reference points and symbols, subtly altering the collective memory and understanding of this crucial period in history. Let me paint a picture of what the alternative might have looked like. Without the B-52, the United States in the 1960s might have operated a mixed force of aging B-36s, shorter-range B-47s requiring extensive tanker support, and perhaps a modest fleet of expensive B-58 Hustlers. The operational complexity would have been higher, the costs greater, and the overall capability lower. By the 1970s, as these aircraft aged out, there might have been a desperate push to field the B-70 Valkyrie despite its enormous costs and vulnerability to surface-to-air missiles. Or perhaps the United States would have transitioned earlier to a dyad rather than a triad, relying almost exclusively on missiles and submarines for nuclear deterrence. This would have saved money in the short term, but sacrificed flexibility and potentially stability in the long term. The ripple effects extend into unexpected areas. For instance, the B-52's ability to carry and launch an enormous variety of weapons, including experimental systems, has made it a valuable testbed for new technologies. Everything from hypersonic missiles to advanced sensors has been tested on B-52s before being deployed on other platforms. Without this flexible testbed, weapons development programs might have been slower or more expensive, requiring dedicated test aircraft for each new system. The pace of innovation in air-delivered weapons could have been meaningfully slower, potentially affecting American military technological leadership. Think about recent events and current plans. The B-52 has been at the forefront of the pivot toward great power competition with China and Russia. Its ability to operate from dispersed bases, to launch long-range standoff weapons, and to provide both conventional and nuclear deterrence makes it central to current Indo-Pacific strategy. Without the B-52, the United States would need to rely more heavily on shorter-range tactical aircraft, requiring tanker support and more vulnerable forward bases, or on naval assets that are themselves increasingly threatened by advanced anti-ship weapons. The flexibility to rapidly deploy bomber forces to different theaters, demonstrating resolve and capability without the permanence of forward-based troops, would be greatly diminished. The planned re-engining and modernization of the B-52 fleet represents an investment that only makes sense because of the aircraft's fundamental soundness and adaptability. The new engines will reduce fuel consumption by 30% or more, dramatically lowering operating costs and extending range. Modern avionics and weapon systems will keep the aircraft relevant against evolving threats. This upgrade is far less expensive than developing and procuring a new bomber to replace the B-52s in their current roles. Without the B-52, the Air Force would face a much more expensive recapitalization challenge, likely requiring more of the new B-21 Raider stealth bombers at a cost of hundreds of millions per aircraft, or continuing to operate less suitable aircraft in roles they weren't designed for. We should also consider what didn't happen because the B-52 existed. Numerous other bomber programs were proposed over the decades, some quite exotic, from nuclear-powered bombers to hypersonic designs. Many of these were not pursued in part because the B-52 adequately filled the role, allowing resources to be directed elsewhere. Without the Stratofortress, some of these exotic and expensive programs might have been pursued, potentially consuming vast resources with uncertain results. The history of military aviation is littered with ambitious programs that promised revolutionary capabilities, but delivered disappointment and cost overruns. The B-52's solid, reliable presence may have saved the United States from some of these expensive dead ends by reducing the perceived urgency to pursue every new concept. Now, as we look toward the future, the question becomes even more interesting. Current plans envision B-52s flying alongside the stealthy B-21 Raiders well into the middle of the 21st century. The older Stratofortresses will handle standoff missions, launching cruise missiles and other weapons from outside defended airspace, while the B-21s penetrate sophisticated air defenses for close-in strikes. This complementary pairing of old and new, affordable mass and expensive stealth provides flexibility and resilience. Without the B-52, the Air Force would face a difficult choice: either buy far more B-21s than currently planned at enormous cost, or accept having a smaller, less capable bomber force. Either option would be militarily riskier and economically more challenging than the planned mix. The story of what would have happened if the B-52 had never been created is ultimately a story about the compounding effects of decisions. One aircraft program, born from the urgent needs of the early Cold War, became a foundation upon which decades of strategy, technology, and industrial capacity were built. Its absence would have forced different choices at multiple junctures, each of which would have cascaded into further divergences from the history we know. The world we inhabit today, with its particular balance of military power, its specific technological trajectories, and its particular historical memory of the Cold War and subsequent conflicts, has been shaped in measurable ways by this one aircraft. When we imagine a world without the B-52, we're not just subtracting an airplane from history. We're imagining a different architecture of deterrence, a different path of technological development, a different industrial base, different diplomatic tools, different outcomes in specific crises and conflicts. We're imagining a world where the United States might have been forced into more expensive and less effective alternatives, where nuclear strategy might have been less flexible and potentially less stable, where conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan would have been fought with different tools and possibly different outcomes. We're imagining a world where the cultural iconography of the Cold War would feature different symbols, where fewer people would have the experience of serving in one of history's longest-lived military aircraft, where the aerospace industry would have developed along different lines. The remarkable thing about the B-52 is that it wasn't designed to last 70 or 80 or potentially 100 years. It was designed to meet the specific needs of the early 1950s, to carry nuclear weapons across intercontinental distances and deliver them on target. That it has been continuously adapted and modernized to remain relevant through the jet age, the missile age, the stealth age, the precision weapons age, and now into the era of great power competition is a testament to both the fundamental soundness of its basic design and the wisdom of choosing flexibility and adaptability over hyper-optimization for a single role. Alternative paths, pursuing more specialized or exotic designs, would likely have led to aircraft with shorter service lives, more frequent replacement cycles, higher costs, and potentially less capability across the diverse range of missions that the B-52 has ultimately performed. So what would have happened if the B-52 had never been created? We would live in a world that looked similar in broad strokes, but different in crucial details. The Cold War would still have been won, but perhaps by narrower margins or at greater cost. Regional conflicts would still have been fought, but with different tools and possibly different outcomes. American military power would still be formidable, but balanced differently, with different strengths and weaknesses. The technological landscape would have different leaders and laggards. The economic geography of the aerospace industry would be different. The collective cultural memory of the nuclear age would have different touchstones. It's a world that's difficult to fully imagine precisely Because the B-52 has been so deeply embedded in the history we actually lived. This is the nature of counterfactual history, the exploration of roads not taken. By understanding what we would have lost if a key decision had gone differently, we gain a deeper appreciation for the actual path history followed and the factors that made certain outcomes possible. The B-52 Stratofortress stands as a reminder that sometimes the most important innovations aren't the flashiest or most exotic, but rather those that prove flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, robust enough to be worth maintaining and upgrading over decades, and fundamentally sound enough in their basic conception that they can be transformed to meet needs their designers never imagined. In a world of rapid obsolescence and constant replacement, the B-52 represents an alternative approach, building something so well and with such inherent adaptability that it transcends its original purpose to become truly timeless. And if you'd like, tell me where in the world you're watching this video from. Your comment is important, and I want to read and respond to it. For more exciting stories like this, click on the video that's playing on your screen right now.